so we're talking about specific families that are important economically and ecologically. Some of the more common ones that you're likely to be seeing plants around here that are in those families. Many of them you'll see we have representatives in the lab that we're learning to sight recognize. We were just getting into the monocots. So the monocots is one of the bigger groups of plants that involves plants that typically have parallel venation to their leaves. They usually have their floral parts in multiples of 3, so things like 3 sepals, 3 petals, 6 David, things like that. They're going to have other characteristics that we talked about related to the root system. They're going to have only 1 pore in their pollen grain, whereas the eudicots are going to have 3 furrows that we're going to get to after we get through the monocot families. And so we're working our way through those families now. We talked about 3 before that, Lauraceae, Magnoliaceae, and the Nymphaceae, which is the water lily family, that are basal angiosperms that doesn't belong to that group. The only one that we talked about that is in this group, monocots, so far is Aeraceae, or the Arum family. Now we're getting into the Liliaceae family. This family used to be much bigger than it is now. This is one of those ones that they've actually torn apart into pieces and they've split it into many, many separate families. Many of the plants that we're learning in lab used to be in this family. For example, Smilax, the greenbrier, used to be in this family. Now it has its own family, Smilacaceae. The Trillium that we're going to learn later in the semester used to be in this family. Now it's in a separate family, Melanothraceae. So they kind of ripped this one to shreds, so it has a lot fewer species than it used to. So around 16 genera, 600 species now. Remember, you don't have to memorize the numbers, just to kind of get a perspective though, because we're hopefully going to talk about another family today that's going to be much bigger than this one is. All of these are going to be herbs of some sort. So just like if you were looking at the Lauraceae family or the Magnolia family, you know if you see an herb, it's not going to be in one of those 2 families because they have woody species, shrubs and trees. It's the opposite for this one. If you've got a tree, you know it's not going to be in this family because these are going to be things that are herbs, herbaceous, no woody material in the above ground parts. They usually are going to have a bulb underneath them, and a bulb is essentially a bud. It's an underground bud that's covered in these fleshy scales. So I'll write that on the board, so we've got a definition for that one. And then you'll see that the root systems come off the bottom of that. If it occurs above the ground, usually it's referred to as a bulbil, not a bulb. So these are usually under the ground. And the characteristics I'm giving you right now are going to be things that are going to be super similar to the next family we're going to talk about, which is the Amaryllidaceae family. Matter of fact, really the only good way to tell those 2 groups apart, because they used to be a part of this same family here, is going to be their ovary position. Right? So I do want you to know these characteristics because it helps you kind of narrow it down to those 2 groups. But if you want to tell something from the Amaryllidaceae from something that's in the Liliaceae family, you're going to have to pay attention to the position of that ovary. Let's talk more about the leaves though. The leaves are going to be simple. They're entire. The only thing that's serrated in this one. But they can have a lot of different types of arrangements. They can be just the base of the plant, so they can have just basal leaves. You can have alternate leaves. You can even have whorled leaves, like in the mediola that you see right here, the cucumber root, where this one has whorled leaves around it. Kind of varies. So leaf arrangement, not a really good way of recognizing the family. You can have pretty much all different combinations. But they are usually sheathing. This is something though that we're going to find is pretty consistent for the monocots. Almost all the monocot families we're going to talk about are going to have these sheathing leaves at the base. So even the grasses, the sedges, the rushes, all the coeals we're going to discuss are going to have that. The arums had that. Amaryllis is going to have that. Orchids are going to have that. So nice sheathing leaves that form kind of that tube. When the blade comes down next to the stem, it doesn't attach directly to the stem at that point. It forms a tube that then wraps around the stem and then attaches lower down at the base of that sheath. Then we have our flowers, which are bisexual or perfect. And symmetry, generally speaking, they're going to be actinomorphic. But there are a few species that have these weird flowers where one of the petals is slightly smaller than the rest, and the back of the flower will be kind of curved to the backward, and it gives it just a slightly zygomorphic symmetry to it. But generally speaking, when you look at a lily, your first instinct is going to stay actinomorphic, and most of them are that. posted this PowerPoint on Canvas. So if everybody's on their computers right now, they will look at that, you can get access to that now. Now, the petals and the sepals are gonna look similar to each other. In most cases, they look identical to each other, so we would classify them as being tepals. And they are multiples of 3 because these are monocots. Usually there's gonna be 3 sepals, 3 petals, which means a total of 6 tepals. You can still tell which ones are the sepals versus the petals, though, remember, by telling where the position is. So you can see these are raised a little bit higher, those are kind of on the inside, so these 3 right here would be our petals, and then this one, and this one on the back, or the lower portion would be our sepals. Right, the 6 tepals total. And that's one of the things that you'll want to use to kind of learn some of these families is pay attention to characteristics like this, where you have some families that only have tepals, and you have some families that only have differentiated sepals and petals, in order you can tell them apart. So kind of create yourself a table where you've got a category there that talks about the petals and sepals, whether they're differentiated or not, whether they're tepals or not. Okay? Color's not usually useful, because there's all sorts of different types of colors lilies. But they do frequently have some patterns on the petals in the sepals, which makes them kind of pretty for pollinators. They'll have these striations. Striations just means they kind of have little lines, little short lines, kind of go along the edge like you see right here. These would be striations right here. Or they'll have little spots, so it's really common to see little spots on the inside of our petals there. Okay, now for the Andreasium, we're going to have 6 stamen, again, a multiple of 3, because this is a monocot family, so 6 stamen. And you'll have 3 fused carpel, again, a multiple of 3. So you'll have a single pistil, but it's going to be a compound pistil, because it's going to be made up of 3 fused carpels. This is one of the ones that you actually dissected in lab. So if you remember doing the tulip belongs in this family. When you did cross-section, you should have seen something that looked very much like that, where you could see each of the different carpels right here, but you can't actually separate them away from each other without cutting them, therefore they're fused together into one pistil. This is still going to be the same as it is for the Amaryllidaceae. They have tepals, they have 6 stamen, they have 3 fused carpels. But the other group, or the other family, is going to have an inferior ovary, whereas things in this family are going to have a superior ovary. So circle, underline, star, highlight. Make sure you know that, right? Make sure you know that for the Liliaceae family, because it's going to be kind of important. If I give you a description or a picture of something that looks like a lily, look closely at it. And really pay attention to its ovary position, because it's not necessarily always a lily, just because it looks like one. Okay, now the fruit is usually a capsule of some sort. And the seeds are typically flat. Sometimes they have almost like a papery feel to them, almost a tissue paper type feel. They're very, very skinny, very flat. This is what they look like right here. This is also going to look super similar to what we're going to see for the Amaryllidaceae. They're going to have capsules as well. They're going to have flat seeds as well. But they are going to have a color, right, a distinctive color to their seeds that is going to be involved in some sort of a coating that covers them, all the things that are in that particular order, something called phytomelin. It's going to make them a very shiny black color, whereas the Liliaceae doesn't have that feature. But otherwise, the fruit's pretty much the same as well. So you can see why they grouped them together into the same family, in the Liliaceae family, a while back. Here are some of our Tennessee examples of species you'll find around here that are in this family. We've got our speckled wood lily. It's called speckled wood lily because the flowers, which you can have, see the 3 petals, the 3 sepals have these kind of little purple striations or purple dots with a little bit of green in them. So the speckling comes from the actual tepal colors right there. And it's got this kind of a bluish looking fruit right here. Nice, kind of wide, kind of strap-like leaves that are going to have that parallel veination that we expect for our monocots to have. And then we have this one, which is our trout lily. And we're actually going to learn a trout lily later in class. We're going to learn how to sight recognize the white trout lily, which is kind of a fun one because it's actually more rare than what you're seeing right here. Most of the trout lilies that are out there are 1 of 2 species, both of which are yellow ones. Okay? They have these kind of drooping flowers, so the flowers don't actually point upwards like you expect them to. They hang downwards, so if you actually want to look down the throat of the flower, you actually have to lay down and look upwards at it. The little stamen kind of hang down this way. And somebody thought that this looked like the side of a brook trout with this kind of speckling pattern, this patchiness with the darker purple and green right here. Debatable, and I'm not always a fan of the common names, but somebody thought that looked like the side of a brook trout. So they gave the name trout lilies. And we'll get into some of these a little bit more later with the white trout lily. We're not going to learn the 2 yellow trout lilies, but I have had students give these to me in the collection before. So it's possible you run across these because they're pretty common in the wooded areas around here. Do not collect too many to decimate the populations. They're out there, but they're not usually in big populations. Now the one site we're going to go to, which hopefully we're going to go to tomorrow, is going to have a massive population of white trout lilies, but Dr. Pelham has asked that we not collect at this site. So nothing that we're going to see tomorrow, nothing at that site at all you're allowed to collect. And but even though we've got a lot of them, we don't want to hurt that population too much. It is mostly kind of isolated on a little island that has a nice little ditch or drainage area around the edge of it, but some of it has creeped over onto the other side and we'll get a chance to see those. And then we have our next family, which we're going to compare to this one, which is going to be our Amaryllidaceae, which is going to look super similar. And I've kind of grouped these two together, Amaryllidaceae and Orchidaceae, into the same grouping because they're both in the same order here. We're talking about the asparagales now at this time, and you can see that there is a shared derived trait for this group. It is called a phytomelous seed coat. Okay? So phytomelin is a covering, kind of a chalky, powdery covering that's on the outside of the seed. In some ways, it's kind of like charcoal, and it's got a very, very rich, dark black color to them. And so it actually is thought to protect them from insects that are going to consume them, possible herbivores. It also can protect the seeds from other sorts of pathogens and from UV radiation. But it's going to be kind of a crust-like covering that we're going to see on the seeds, which is going to make them very, very black. Now, everything in this order has this, with the exception, ironically enough, is of one of the families we're going to talk about, which is Orchidaceae. So that means Amaryllidaceae is going to have this feature, but the orchids aren't. Okay? But use that to help you recognize Amaryllidaceae from Liliaceae. So let's get into that one first and see how similar it is to those lilies. This one is called the Amaryllis family or the Daffodil family. Okay, so if you're wondering what the actual daffodils were in, this is it. Okay, not the Buttercup family, that's a different one. And they're in the Amaryllidaceae family. They have around 850 species. They are herbs as well, so they don't have any woody species as well. And usually these are terrestrial, meaning you don't find a lot of aquatic Amaryllidaceae. They also have bulbs at the base of them, so step number one, already starting to look similar to our lilies. Okay, these are simple, entire, just like they were for the lilies, but they have less variation in terms of their arrangements. You don't really see whorl in this family. You see alternate basal, but there's a lot of lilies that have alternate basal things as well. They do tend to be a bit thinner though, and oftentimes these are linear. Not all of them, and we're going to see an example of one of the ones in Tennessee that doesn't follow this, but there's a lot of them that have almost grass-like leaves. They look like little grass leaves. And they are also typically sheepy, like most of the monocots we're going to talk about. Okay, flowers usually actinomorphic. They are perfect, they're bisexual, and they'll have bracts at the base of them. So it'll look like it's got these sepals down at the bottom where the flower attaches to the inflorescence stalk, but those are actually bracts, because remember the actual sepals are going to be part of tepals. They're going to look like the petals. Color is also very variable within this family. You can see we've got some whites, we've got some pinks, we've got some reds. There's lots of different types of colorations, just like there were for lilies, but they do have the 6 tepals. Now, certain genera within this family will have an additional feature associated with the flower that you definitely won't see in the lilies. But I'm going to caution you that not all of the Amaryllidaceae have it either. But there are certain genera that do, and you're familiar with one of them, which are going to be our daffodils. Right? They're going to have a hypanthium. Right? This is consistent across the group. Everything in this family has a hypanthium. Lilies didn't have that. Okay? The second one here is only found in some of the genera, and it's something called a corona. Now, I used to ask this question in my class, and I got a very different answer than I did nowadays after the last 3 years. But what does corona make you think of? There we go, that's the one I'm looking for, fear, okay? Nowadays, people think of the coronavirus, right? But it applies to that as well. Does anybody know why it's called the coronavirus? The little proteins on it, exactly right. I'm gonna do a terrible job of drawing this virus, but I'm gonna try. Right? If you're looking at the virus, it has kind of this spherical shape to it. And it has these weird little protein things that stick out, that look kind of like this. Everybody know what I'm talking about? These little things. Everybody seen the picture of the coronavirus? And those are the coronas. These right here are the coronas. Okay, now let's go back to the ear for a second. Okay, what's on the bottle of the ear? It's a crown, exactly right. Okay, so that's what it means. Corona is going to mean crown. Okay, it is a weird petal-like or crown-like structure that occurs between the petals and the stamen. So the stamen are actually inside here. Okay, this is where the corona is, and then you have the petals and sepals down here below that. Okay, so obviously you're going to find this in the Narcissus genus, so the one that's for the daffodil genera. And we're going to have it for a couple of other species as well, other genus as well. But not all of them have a corona. But you will not find a corona in the Liliaceae. So if it's got that, you automatically know what family it's going to be in. It's going to be this Amaryllidaceae. Everybody see the crown? They're going to look very closely at the bottom of the portrait there. Whatever helps you, if this one helps you better, that's fine. Alright, Andreaceae. We're going to have 6 stamen, just like we did for the lilies. And they can do the normal thing where you have nice separate filaments, nice separate stamen, all individual like you see in the lilies. Look how much that looks like a lily. Very much like a lily, but nice little separate stamen right here. Or they can do something a bit unique, where the filaments actually fuse together into a cup-like structure. It looks a bit like a corona, but it actually is not the same thing as a corona, because a corona is separate from the stamen and the petals. But this is a different thing right here, because the base of the filaments have actually kind of spread out and fused to each other with this kind of petal-like substance right here, forming a little petal-weight cup on the inside of it. Again, not something you're going to find in the lilies. Has anybody ever seen that flower out around here? The one on the bottom. Anybody seen anything like this in the woods before?
What's it called?
It's definitely around here. You usually see it during the summer. It's a big cypress, beech ridge. You've seen
What's
that
it
one?
called? I've seen
Oh, it's
some.
called spider lily.
Yeah, I've seen some.
Yes. We're gonna actually see it again too. I'll show you those in Tennessee species.
No, it is.
All right, now getting into our gynoecium, it has 3 fused carpels again. It looks very much like the cross section that we saw for our lily. But the ovaries inferior. Again, highlight star circle where you have to remember that. And you can see that in your daffodils. Right? Even though we've got this weird fusion, there's the hypanthium right there where the stamen, the petals, and the sepals all fuse together into that structure. The hypanthium does attach here, right? And then your ovary is down here below that. So it's still considered an inferior ovary. All right. Again, our fruit is usually a capsule. You can see it looks very much similar to what we saw for the other one. It's got the 3 lobes to it because it's got the 3 carpels. And the same thing was for the lilies, they pop open the same way. And the seeds are flat. To spherical, depending on the species. One of the ones that you had on your midterm exam was actually a species that's in this family. So that was the capsule that you saw, and you have the nice shiny black seeds up there in the top left picture that you can see that were spilling out. They had the consistency of tissue paper, and they have that phytomelanous layer on them. So that charcoal black coloration to it. Remember, looking for the bold and underlined words. Those are the most important ones to know about certain families, because either they're very distinctive or they help you tell them apart from some of the other families that are similar to it that we're going to talk about. Okay, so things around here in Tennessee that you'll see that are in this, we've got all of the things that are in the daffodil genus, Narcissus. And there's many different species. This is the most common one. This is Narcissus pseudonarcissa. There's another one that's Narcissus emerum, which has more whitish petals, and the corona is an orange color, and it's a little bit smaller. It's not quite as long as the petals are like in this one right here, but they all have a corona. Right? Everything that's in that genus is going to have a corona. So all of our daffodils fall in this family. And then we have our spider lily here, our Carolina spider lily, Monocots caroliniana, which has these very linear looking tepals. These are the tepals right here. It's one of the ones that forms that petaloid cup because the bases of the filaments fuse together with this kind of petal tissue between them right here. Very pretty. You can see why it's called a spider lily though, because they look like little spiders on top of it. They tend to form little clumps, like you may find 2 or 3 of them growing together out in the woods, and then that's it. Like just that one little section, and then they'll be spread out further away if you find any more in the woods. So, but they tend to flower around summertime, so they should be coming out, I would say probably in late May, early June is when you usually see those. And they've got very long strap-like leaves. Okay. Not exactly linear, but it does look very much like a lily. All right, here's the other one we're going to talk about that's in this family. This one's called snowflake. It has little drooping flowers, which are kind of the classic campanulate flower, the ones that are bell-shaped. And remember, bell-shaped ones usually do droop like that. You can recognize it pretty easily though, because each one of the tepals is white, but they'll have a green spot right there on the tip of it. A lot of people will plant this one as a cultivated species, but it does escape, and it has been naturalized in certain areas, so sometimes I'll get this one in the collection for people as well. And it tends to have kind of very pointy looking tepals to them right there, where you can see that distinctive green tip to it. Very linear leaves though. All right, now the next group we're going to talk about, we're going to spend a little extra time on this one, because this is a very unique family, and it's a very large family. And most people tend to really like this family. It thankfully has a very good common name that goes right along with the scientific name. This is Orchidaceae, which is the orchid family. Very big family though. We're talking about 20,000 different species. That's bigger than some of the whole groups of plants that we talked about before, like non-vascular plants, things like that. So that's a pretty large family. And for this reason also, because you have so many species that are closely related to each other and oftentimes living in the same area, hybridization can be a big problem. So we're really going to come back to this again and talk about some of the things we discussed before in terms of reproductive isolation mechanisms relating to preventing hybridization between these species through their pollination mechanisms. These are herbs, but every once in a while you'll find some species that are vines. Those are usually more tropical species though. Not trees though. So what you're seeing up here, okay, this tree that here, this is a different tree. This is a different species. The orchid is actually sitting on it, because many of them, as we're going to find out, are epiphytes. Okay? Epiphytic, remember, is going to be a plant that is growing on either another plant or a surface above the ground, right, for support, but does not draw any nutrients or water from that plant that they're sitting on. They're not parasites, in other words. Right? But they also are not going to have any root systems that actually connect them to the ground. They're going to get everything that they need from the air around them, from the atmosphere that's around them. Okay, so I'll put the definition up here for epiphyte. You should know this from lab, but just in case we don't cross our terms from lab into lecture, we'll recap that we do need to know what this one is. Okay, so non-parasitic plant, getting everything that it needs from the air, the water in the atmosphere, dust particles, things like that. So that does mean they can go through some pretty extended periods of time when it's dry, because it's not raining, it's not really humid necessarily in the air. But they usually can withstand that. These epiphytes have special adaptations to help them do with that. Many of them are going to have can photosynthesis for this reason as well. Now, you do have some that are terrestrial as well, but most of the ones you're probably familiar with are things that are epiphytes. They're gonna have very different root systems though, depending on which type you're talking about. Because even though this is an epiphyte and it doesn't have roots connecting it to the soil, doesn't mean that it doesn't have roots, right? So these are plants that have these are vascular plants, they have root systems. They just have different types of root systems than the ones that are terrestrial. If they're actually growing on the ground and they're terrestrial, they're gonna have a tuberous root system, which means that they form these kind of thickened areas underneath the root system, which is for food storage. Okay. If they are an epiphyte, they have what are referred to as aerial roots. It can look kind of stringy like this, and it's gonna have a special coating over the surface of it that's designed for these to be exposed to the air, as opposed to actually being in the soil. But they do what any roots would do. They're gonna absorb water and nutrients. That's what root systems are for. And even the epiphytes do that as well. Okay, now the surface feature you're gonna find on the ones that are epiphytes are gonna have something called velamen that surrounds the surface of the root system. This is a layer of dead cells, right? So it's actually dead cells that makes it kind of spongy. It's multiple layers. It's not just a single layer. So multi-layered epidermis that covers the roots for some epiphytic plants. It tends to look kind of frosty gray or white colored here, or almost silvery. If you've ever seen some of them that have kind of the shimmer to them, it's because the cells are dead. But when you water it, it actually turns green because the cells that are dead on there are actually transparent or translucent. When they get wet, they become even more transparent, and then you end up actually seeing the photosynthetic cells that are underneath it, so it gets kind of a greenish color. That's only if it gets wet. When it's dry, usually it's kind of that white silvery color. And functions for the velamen. It's going to do one of the functions that we expect roots to do, which is going to absorb water and nutrients, but it does more than that. So, capable of absorbing atmospheric moisture and nutrients, getting what it needs in terms of the water, for the plant, but it also is thought to protect it from UV radiation. So if you know anything about sun rays, they can damage DNA. That applies not just to humans, that applies to anything, including plants. Because these roots are exposed to the air, they're not underneath the soil where they're gonna be blocked from the sunlight. They're gonna be exposed to UV radiation, which can damage those cells. And what this does is basically acts as its own natural sunscreen. You've got these dead cells on the outside, they're not gonna be harmed by this because they're dead, and it's multiple layers of that, which is going to absorb some of that UV radiation, help protect them from that. Second, because these things attach to surfaces like other plants or rock surfaces, things like that, it sort of works like a glue, and it helps them to stick and adhere to whatever the substrate is that they're sticking to. And it's kind of hard to pull an epiphytic orchid off of whatever it's growing onto because of that sticky substance kind of holding it in place. Now, it's not sticky to the touch, okay, but it does work like a glue when it's actually adhering to the surface. And then it also protects the vascular tissues of the root systems, which again are exposed above the ground. Other features that orchids have, because they're going to have a lot of unique ones. They have alternate whorled leaves that are usually sheathing, because again, we're talking about monocots here. Most of those have got sheathing ones that we're going to talk about. Simple, entire, nice smooth margins. But they are also coriaceous or succulent. Now, coriaceous is not something that we got a chance to discuss in lab this time around. Usually I put out 2 different holly plants in lab so you can actually feel what coriaceous means. Coriaceous means it feels kind of like leather. Very thickened, kind of hard, and very leathery feeling in terms of its texture. And I'll have some orchids here that I'm going to bring back to class in the next class that you'll get a chance to actually feel what that feels like. Or they can be kind of succulent, a little bit 3-dimensional as they store a little bit of water, which is a very useful thing to do if you're epiphyte and you're not really exposed or have root systems attached to that soil to get your own water. The flowers are usually perfect. They are definitely zygomorphic, no question. There can only be one way that you can cut the flower and get mirror images, and that's because oftentimes you've got one weird petal and one weird sepal that's doing something completely different than the rest of them are doing. And we're going to talk about what that special petal is. It has a specific function to it. There's a range in terms of size and showiness of orchids. Most people, when they think orchid, they think beautiful, beautiful big flowers like we see over here. Right? But that's not always the case. We're going to learn one in lab that has very, very tiny little flowers about this big. And some of them are kind of a bronze color or green color, yellowish color. You don't even necessarily notice them because they blend into the bark of the tree that they're actually growing on. So it doesn't have to be real showy and big like we usually think of for orchids. Okay? All right, now we'll get into more details in the grade in the next class. I'm going to stop here for today. What I'm going to do with the orchid, we're going to bring it back and play pollinator. And we're going to